So, I guess I want to talk a little bit about this book, Milk and Honey. Um, Obviously by Ruby. I think her name is Kerr. And I guess I suppose I want to talk about what poetry is exactly, because it's a complicated subject, and sometimes it's like we know what it's not, but it's difficult to define poetry. It's difficult to get to those core aspects or those core characteristic traits of what poetry actually is. And for example, some of these poems just fall really short. I mean, they're extremely underdeveloped. Some of them are actually very nonsensical. Some of them, of course, some of them lack structure. That could be intentional, but sometimes I don't think it is intentional, and I don't think it's beneficial to the poem. And some of them are just kind of really hard to understand because of how vague they actually are. For example, this one says, "You've touched me without even touching me," and that's just so vague that I question if it's even poetry. I think poetry has to. I'm not even sure if poetry actually has to be impactful to be poetry. I mean, I think that's a good question. Does poetry actually have to be impactful to be poetry? Can it be more lively? Can it be a little bit more happy? But I do think it has to have some sort of substance, and some of her writing has no substance at all. For example, "You talk to me too much," he whispers into my ear. "I can think of better ways to use that mouth." It's just a little weird, to be honest. Okay, this one's a little ridiculous. "My name sounds so good, French kissing your tongue." I mean, that's not really a poem. It's more of like a sentence, or it's more of like a thought, really. And again, I get to the question of what poetry actually is, because it's one of those things that are extremely hard to put into words what poetry actually is. I suppose if it makes you feel some type of way, or it makes you feel good or something, it might be a poetry. For example, this one was, you were temptingly beautiful, but stung when I got close." I mean, of course, some of these things don't even have to be said out loud or written down. And one of her critiques is that she's extremely lazy. I mean, not extremely lazy, but sometimes she can be lazy with her writing. There are a few poems I liked in here, but I mean, there's a lot of stuff that is just unnecessary. So this one's like a self-help book. This one's, "You must enter a relationship with yourself before anyone else." I mean, that's kind of good advice, but it's not poetry. It's advice. Like, again, this one, like a self-help book. "It takes grace to remain kind in cruel situations." Or this one, "Fall in love with your silhouette." I mean, I suppose that's good because, your silhouette will always be there. Right? I think that's the point. Some of the graphics are, they're decent. They're not anything to write home about. Some of these are a little bit more abstract looking. They're decent. I mean, and I think it begs the question, because this is something that often happens in our society, where someone will be extremely talented at something, and they will never get recognition for one reason or another. Either they're not lucky enough to, they don't know the right people. There is an amalgamation of thousands of things that can occur as to why someone's not successful. And it strikes me when someone is successful and the work is subpar, you know. And I think that's another good question, is like, why are some people just extremely successful without having any particular skill in that area? I'm not saying she isn't skilled, but I'm saying is that this is like, if you wanted to like grab a good poetry book, like, oh, I want to read something really good, this ain't it. Like, for example, The Way They Leave tells you everything. And again, with the self-help book theme, like this one is like a to-do list after a breakup. And by the way, no one can tell you what to do after a breakup, you know. I mean, there are certain things you can do that might help, but nobody can tell you what to do after a breakup. You know, you kind of have to learn that by yourself, you know. And some people, you know, might want to be alone. Some people, this is another subject. Is like some people, like they go to their vices, or they try to escape, or they immediately try to get into a relationship and expect that other person to kind of fix them, or alleviate some of the emptiness that the other person left. And you know, that's not particularly helpful or healthy at all either, you know. Yeah, so I mean, I flinch when you touch me, I fear it is him. And then it has like this really kind of like scribble design. I mean, I don't even know if I'm capable of critiquing poetry, because I'm not really sure what it is. But this, I don't know, it's some of it is not really that good. I mean, there are good themes and subjects that, you know, she attempts to write about, but none of them really touch home with me. Like, none of them like are, oh my god, that's so good. I could have written that. And that's another thing. Like, a lot of people will make fun of her, like in the comments of YouTube, and they'll be like, oh, I could have written that. I mean, I could have written that, like, you know, I could have added a couple breaks, and I could have made it, you know, really eloquent, or, you know, interesting to read, or, you know, that people make fun of her like that. There's another one. I am a museum full of art, but you had your eyes shut. And why does it take up the whole page? And that's another critique. Like, it's just a page filler. Like, there's no substance. It's just... I mean, on the one hand, like, okay, so you put one line on the page, so it's like, this is the only thing you have to pay attention to, right? But when it's a bad poem, it's like, it kind of illustrates why it's a bad poem. Like, if you're gonna have one page, it better be a good poem, and most of these are bad, so it doesn't help her. This one's particularly bad. I came all this way to give you all these things, but you aren't even looking. I mean, I suppose that means she could have been like a good wife, she could have been a good girlfriend, she could have helped this man out. But again, it's not particularly good. It's not deep. And it doesn't have to be deep, but it's not like it doesn't. It's so vague, and it doesn't offer any other thoughts other than its face value. And that's why I think it's particularly bad poetry. The abused and the abuser, I have been both. I mean, that's kind of interesting, I suppose. Like, the cycle of abuse. And people learn how to abuse and manipulate other people. And instead of, like, trying to stop the cycle, they perpetuate the cycle. I mean, just flipping through, like, you can... like you can flip through this book and just pick something random, and the majority of times it's gonna be a bad poetry. Oh, and that's another thing I didn't like. Um, she like she tries to make it like super deep. Like, for example, in she writes a love letter from, she calls it a love letter to me, to you, and she says, "You have made it to the end with my heart in your hands. Thank you for arriving here safely, for being tender with the most delicate part of me. Sit down and breathe. You must be tired." Like, that's so exaggerated. You know, she's acting like this is the most exhilarating, most heart pounding, most, you know, teary eyed poetry you could ever read. And it's not, that's not what it is. And I think this has like the veneer of being deep. Like it has like a certain aesthetic that might make you think it's deep or it's more profound, but it's not. It's superficial. It's like good poetry is impactful. I mean, it doesn't have to be like the deepest thing ever, but it certainly is impactful. Like what's the difference between like regular sentences and poetry? It's the way you say it. It's the intention behind the words. Like, for example, like in when you write essays, sometimes you have to say the most simplistic interpretation of words to get your point across. In poetry, that's not necessarily the case. You know, you can go the long way. You can go, you know, maybe like a more deeper level of analysis. You can use words to convey other feelings. You can use tone. You can use imagery. You can use similes to put that picture in your head. Like, that's the difference between writing like an essay format and poetry. Is like there's something else there. There's something to grab onto. There's something to feel there. And this book just doesn't do it. And it's not good poetry. I mean, there's a couple good poems in here. I mean, I struggle to find ones that I particularly like, but there are like a couple good ones. And some of these are very like an angsty teenager kind of. Like they call it like Instagram poetry. I know I saw one that I liked. Like this one, I mean, this one was, it says, the poetry is like, "I want your hands to hold, not my hands, your lips to kiss, not my lips, but other places." I mean, so great. Like, and some of the images are a little cringy, a little much, right? And like some of these are like examples of like what her favorite date would be. For example, she says the perfect date: "Nothing is safer than the sound of you reading out loud to me." I mean, that's not really a date, but like, I mean, I guess for her it's perfect date. I guess for me, it'd be like, it's boring. You know, some of these are so vague that you can just like interpret it in any way you wish, and like you'll probably be right. Alright, that's I've wasted enough of your time, but this is not a particularly good poetry. Sad faced.